Good afternoon, and welcome to the webinar hosted by the Investor Responsibility Research Center Institute and the Sustainable Investments Institute on a new research report, The Top 25 U.S. Electric Utilities, Climate Change, Corporate Governance, and Politics. Our agenda for the webinar this afternoon is introductions, an in-depth review of the research, some words from the IRC Institute with their perspective on the research, and then we'll take your questions. The logistics for the webinar today are as follows. All of the attendees are in listen-only mode, but we do welcome your questions. Throughout the webinar, feel free to type your questions into the question function in your control panel. Following the presentation of the research, we'll read the questions aloud and respond to them. Following the webinar, you will receive a link with a replay to this webinar, so we are recording this webinar right now. For your information, this report and all others from the IRC Institute are available on our website, www.ircinstitute.org, at no charge. We encourage you to share information about this report. If you're doing that on social media, you can find us on Twitter at IRRC Research and at SI2 News. If you happen to have any audio issues during the webinar, please feel free to contact GoToWebinar at 1-800-263-6317. We have three speakers today. The first one is Heidi Welsh. Heidi is the founder and executive director of the Sustainable Investments Institute, a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. that conducts objective research and publishes reports on social and environmental issues. She has more than 2 decades of experience analyzing and writing about corporate responsibility issues, and she's also authored a number of reports on behalf of the IRRC Institute. Also with us today is Sarah Murphy. She too conducts research and authors reports. She focuses on how social and environmental factors affect investment analysis and decision making. She is the primary lead author on this report. And then our third speaker today is John Lekumnik. He is the executive director of the IRC Institute, and with the board, he's led the organization to become a leading funder of objective academic and practitioner research on a wide array of investment issues. He too has decades of experience, and he was an institutional investor, including time as the investment advisor to the New York City pension funds. You may also know John for his new book that is out, What They Do With Your Money, published by Yale University Press. Just a couple words about both the organizations in case you're not familiar with them. IRC is a nonprofit that was established in 2005, and essentially what the organization, it funds and disseminates objective research for investors and other stakeholders that's unbiased on a wide range of issues, everything from executive compensation to environmental issues. We have a new report out on the food industry, so just a broad range of issues so that investors can make informed decisions. Again, it's both academic and practitioner research. We have an annual research award. We're accepting submissions for that right now. It's two $10,000 awards. There's information on the website about that if you're interested in learning more. And all of the research, there's more than 40 reports, are all available at the website at absolutely no charge. And then I will hand it over to Heidi, and she will fill you in about SI2 and why this study was conducted. Heidi?
All right, Kelly, thanks so much. So SI2 was founded, we've been around since 2010, and we're funded primarily by subscriptions from college and university endowments and big pension funds. And we do basically two things. So proxy season analytics, looking at background information, company-specific reports, and we do forecasts and analysis of what happens in proxy season, and that's our sort of subscription offering. We also do reports like this one, sort of context-setting additional projects. This slide notes we've done some stuff on political spending, shale energy, integrated reporting, corporate governance, board oversight of sustainability, and nanotech, and we're going to do one pretty soon, also funded by the IRC Institute, on corporate lobbying in the States. Again, the focus is on impartial research to sort of inform what can be really charged debates, with the thought that you need a common body of data to have really good discussion and good decision making. With respect to this report, this is basically has been a connect the dots exercise. There's a lot of research out there on climate change and climate risk, a lot of research on political spending and corporate involvement in politics, and also a lot on corporate governance, but not a lot that connects all three things. So that's what we tried to do here. And focusing on a sector with really high impact with respect to climate change. Utilities, as Sarah will point out, are responsible for a significant portion of U.S. carbon emissions. They're a highly regulated sector. They face some pretty substantial impacts from the Clean Power Plan. All of that's in litigation right now. They're very politically active. They spent more than, just these 25 companies spent more than $400 million in the last 5 years, but some spend a lot more than others. They also have a really muted, what we're calling a muted corporate governance mandate on climate action. There's not very much evidence that companies have disclosed about their formal governance responsibilities for climate risk. So companies really have a couple of choices with respect to climate change. When they're utilities, they can work to really protect the status quo, or they can try to change, move to different business models, new energy mixes. They can litigate, as I mentioned. They can spend to influence public policy through elections as well as in lobbying. They can reform their corporate governance. So there's really major long-term investor pressure on climate change risk. There's a push for more political activity transparency and a lot of focus on the composition of boards of directors. So Sarah is going to talk about some of this stuff and what we found.
Thanks, Heidi. So when we did this report, we focused on 12 key areas of analysis, and we'll be looking at each of these as we go through the presentation. But these were energy mix, the deployment of advanced metering infrastructure, return on capital relative to capital expenditures, stranded carbon asset risk, emissions intensity, implied emissions limits, potential legal liability, board climate change oversight and expertise, environment and climate change management incentives, political spending and public policy position disclosure, Clean Power Plan litigation, and corporate political activity governance. So we'll go through each of these in the slides that are coming up here. But to start with, we can give you the sort of overall findings that we had when we applied numerical scoring to each one, depending on the extent to which the utility in question was more oriented toward change or more protective of the status quo as it exists now. And you can see here from our findings that NRG falls right at the bottom of the list, along with Southern and AEP. And NextEra Energy, Exelon, and PG&E come much closer to the top of the list. So we can proceed on with the particular factors that we looked at. We'll start with the exposure to carbon asset risk point, specifically looking at electricity sources by fuel cost. Please note that you're not going to see the full study universe in these slides because of space constraints. So this slide is missing those companies that don't generate their own power, and it's also missing the middle of the pack. So we're showing you those with highest risk and lowest risk. And you'll see that AES has the highest proportion of coal in its fuel mix for the year 2013, which was the most recent year for which we had data at the time. And you'll also notice that coal makes up more than 75% of the mix for 6 of the companies in our study universe. So those on the left of our bar chart. And on the other extreme, we have 6 companies where it accounts for about 10% or less of their energy mix. On the next slide, we looked at the deployment of advanced metering infrastructure and distributed generation. Advanced metering infrastructure can be seen as an indication of companies' commitment to demand-side management of energy consumption. It's an integrated system of smart meters, communications networks, and data management systems that enables two-way communication between utilities and customers. And in our study, we saw deployment variation not only by the parent utility, but also by state. And this is partly because states have widely varied requirements. Some mandate AMI deployment, some do not at all, and everything in between. So we had some variability within that. But even taking that limitation into account, we found that some of these utilities presented clear leadership in this regard. We found that CenterPoint Energy, also California's three biggest investor-owned utilities, which were Edison International, PG&E, and Sempra Energy, along with Duke Energy and Consolidated Edison, were leaders in grid modernization and AMI deployment. PPL also factors in the leadership category because it has presented leadership in AMI deployment in both Pennsylvania and Florida. Another factor that we tried to look at, and this is sort of experimental, but we think that we're onto something here. This was actually based on a lot of the analysis we see from conventional investors when they're looking at oil and gas companies, particularly as is related to what's known as their carbon asset risk. I suspect most of you know what we're talking about in that regard, but just to be certain, there have been studies that suggest that, and frankly, the preponderance of studies suggest that we need to keep warming, average global warming, below 2 degrees Celsius if we're to head off some of the worst possible impacts of climate change. And in fact, since we published this study, some work has emerged that suggests that even that threshold may be too high. And in order to achieve that goal, there are estimates that say that the majority of the world's proven reserves of oil, gas, and coal must not be exploited. That is to say, we mustn't burn them. So within that context, we're looking at the possibility that oil and gas assets that various companies have on their balance sheets and have, as part of their valuation, may no longer be able to hold the value that they were originally estimating, therefore rather significantly changing a company's valuation in financial terms. So one of the things that conventional investors have been observing at oil and gas companies is that for all of their investment, they have been seeing very little return. And so one metric that a lot of conventional analysts have been looking at there is the return on capital as a ratio to capital expenditures. So, and if anyone ever tells you that a single financial metric tells you everything you need to know about a company, I think you know that you're perhaps hearing some misrepresentation of the facts, and so we won't do that here either. But it is something interesting when taken in combination with all the other factors that we looked at. So here you can see the results for the companies in our universe, and you'll see that according to that metric, First Energy and Duke Energy come fairly low. That is to say that it doesn't seem like they're getting very much return for their investments, whereas Eversource and CenterPoint place rather high in that valuation. Another aspect we considered for stranded carbon asset risk was a study that was conducted at the University of Oxford Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment. They've done quite a lot of work related to the stranded carbon asset risk issue, and they specifically considered utilities. They did not cover all of the utilities in our universe, but they covered a good number of them. And they analyzed them against a variety of metrics, a variety of possible scenarios relating to carbon asset stranding. You'll see here they looked at carbon dioxide intensity. They considered the age of the various physical plants per utility. They looked at local air pollution issues, water stress, coal quality, the quality of the coal that they actually use, the extent to which the company's existing plants are retrofittable for carbon capture and sequestration technology, if that should ever become viable. And they looked at heat stress. So here you'll see that AEP comes in with the highest risk, whereas PPL comes in with the lowest, according to that study. We also looked at normalized greenhouse gas emissions intensity for 2013. And what we found was just 4 companies by themselves account for more than 1% of all reported greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, according to the data that they have to report to the Environmental Protection Agency. And you'll see here the most and least carbon intensive companies normalized by generation and megawatt hours for comparison purposes so that you can get some sort of sense of scale comparing one company to another. So NiSource comes out with the most intense emissions, whereas Exelon does better by this metric. Another factor that we considered was what we're calling implied emission limits. There was some excellent work that came out in November 2015 by a group called GNVGL Energy. And these are experts in energy, and they do testing and they deliver testing and expertise for the energy sector. And in this case, they were looking to analyze the impact of the Clean Power Plant on electric utilities. And they took into account the variability of impact from state to state depending on their existing regulatory frameworks, and also local issues that affect different power plants differently. And the results of their analysis are shown here on this chart, and that covers almost the full extent of our universe where the company provides its own generation. We are missing just 3 that were not large enough for their study sample. Those are NiSource, Edison International, and Sempra Energy. You can see here, though, that AES and PPL come out with the highest risk when considered against the national average in terms of their implied emissions limits, whereas you can also see the Public Service Enterprise Group and PG&E come in at the lower end of the risk spectrum. And because I know that slide is just a little difficult to see because there's a lot going on, you can take a look at the next slide, which shows the companies more in absolute terms. If we can just go to the next slide, you can see where the companies fall in terms of their rankings in general. If we continue on, we looked also at potential legal liability and absolute greenhouse gas emissions are a reasonable proxy for this liability. Researchers at the Michigan Technological University published a paper analyzing the extent to which utilities might face legal liability as a result of regulations like the CPP. They considered a number of different liability scenarios. Some they looked at pure polluter pays principles, some they looked at shared responsibility between the utility and the ratepayers. In all scenarios, though, they found that liability varied in magnitude, but that it was consistent with absolute emissions. And so we use that as a proxy for the potential legal liability that companies might face in the future. So here you'll see again, we've got the scale in front of you on this slide. And you can see that the most and least carbon intensive companies, as normalized by generation in megawatt hours, are provided here. And the difference between the one with the highest liability, Duke Energy, versus the lowest is really quite striking for comparison purposes. If we go to the next slide, we looked at corporate governance and specifically at board committee charter responsibilities. And we've noticed this particularly in the context of this proxy season, and Heidi will talk a little bit more about that. But some institutional investors are looking for more explicit board oversight responsibilities as concerns managing the risks and opportunities posed by climate change. And from our research and our studies of corporate 10Ks and proxy filings, we found that few companies have reported into incorporating such responsibilities into their formal governance documents. You'll see that just 3 of the 25 utilities that have board committees with explicit climate change oversight responsibilities, those were AES, Eversource Energy, and Pepco Holdings, now part of Exelon. We found that 4 do not mention either climate change or the environment in any committee charter. Those were CenterPoint Energy, CMS Energy, Edison International, and ONEOK. And all but 8 charge a board committee with oversight of political spending. Those that don't are AEP, CMS Energy, Entergy, First Energy, NiSource, ONEOK, PG&E, and Exelon. If we looked also at each individual board member and their particular expertise as related to both just general environmental issues and climate change issues in particular. And here again, we've seen this playing out in the current proxy season, where some investors are filing shareholder resolutions asking that companies nominate board members with explicit expertise in these areas. So we reviewed here again the corporate filings to the SEC on the part of the companies themselves, where they provide biographies of board members and their backgrounds. And we also looked further to see if board members had biographies on external organizations or corporations. We took a look at those as well. And what we found was that at 15 of the companies in our universe, The members' biographies that were presented in corporate filings contained no mention of the environment. Or in some cases, the company said that they had expertise, but they based that assertion solely on the fact of that person having, for example, served as a CEO of a utility in the past. And we didn't consider that a sufficient definition of expertise in that area, so we didn't accept that as a determining factor. What we found was that at 5 companies, Duke, Exelon, AEP, PG&E, and CMS, there were 2 or more directors that have such credentials, but only 3 companies, Duke, Edison International, and PG&E, specifically mentioned climate change expertise. Another interesting thing was that to the extent that this expertise was mentioned at all, it was often not a point of emphasis in proxy statements. So for some directors where we externally found stronger expertise in environmental or climate change issues than was necessarily mentioned in the proxy statement. And also in some cases we found that board members who did have some expertise in these areas had used it in the past to resist greater stringency in environmental legislation and regulation rather than to seek more change-oriented goals. For the next slide, we also looked at the extent to which companies have incentives for climate change management for their boards of directors and senior management. And what we found was that not many really do. Very few have anything that goes beyond compliance rewarding, for example. We found that Xcel Energy stood out for having stronger and more specific quantifiable disclosure along these lines. However, we also found that it joined Duke Energy and Pepco in apparently having slackened its incentives compared to previous years. So there seems to be an overall decline in the way these utilities were handling this particular aspect of our research. We also looked at political activity footprint in several ways. Here we're looking at elections and lobbying expenditures from 2011 to 2015. And please note that the data that we're showing here include federal lobbying and national 527 political committees. It excludes state-level lobbying, but it does include state-level candidates, political committees, and ballot initiatives. The 25 companies we studied spent at least $407 million on elections and lobbying from 2011 to 2015. And the reason I say at least was because the full year figures were not yet available for 2015 when we ran the numbers. We found that Southern was by far the biggest spender, and you can see considerably more so than the second highest spender, Duke Energy. Southern spent about $65 million. Interestingly, we note now that Southern is under an SEC investigation, and ratepayers are suing the company for alleged fraud at its Kemper coal plant, which was supposed to be a model of the, quote, clean coal, unquote, development, and it was also supposed to be the plant where carbon capture and sequestration would be demonstrated to be effective. Those things so far have yet to come to light, and it appears, according to some of the filing documents, that Southern may have concealed information from regulators in this regard. So we find this interesting in comparison. On the next slide, we tried to look, because of course these are companies of varying sizes, we tried to provide something that would allow us to compare apples to apples. And we provide here what we're calling political activity spending intensity, where we calculated a political activity spending figure for all of the companies based on the total reported federal lobbying and discoverable spending on federal and state elections and ballot initiatives, using data from the Center for Responsive Politics and the National Institute on Money in State Politics. So we normalize these total expenditures by net revenue to arrive at the figures shown above. And you'll note some negative numbers in there. Those are simply a product of the fact that that company had negative net revenues that year. And so, of course, you get a negative number when that's the case. You'll note here that Southern and AEP are among, again, the largest spenders, and they're also the most intensive spenders when we normalize in this fashion. The next factor that we looked at was companies' disclosure of their climate change positions. And this is, mostly from their websites and other public documents that they publish. So this is a measure of their transparency. And We found that Exelon and PG&E stand out with the amount of information and detail they provide on climate change policy. However, 13 companies in our research universe say nothing about the subject on their websites. Of these, 6 do provide information to CDP, which may be familiar to some of you. It was formerly called the Carbon Disclosure Project, and it's a group that gathers information on various environmental issues, including climate change. However, we note that CDP information is slightly less easy for the average user to get to if they don't know what they're doing and where to look for it, whereas website disclosure can be considered perhaps the most transparent for average users. So here you can see that the majority of our universe really didn't have much disclosure at all. We also looked at Clean Power Plan litigation to see how companies are participating in the public policy process. And in this case, we examined what evidence exists about utilities' effort to scuttle or support the Clean Power Plan, which is currently being litigated. I'd like to note that it's not our intent to pass judgment on the CPP's efficacy in combating climate change, but rather just to acknowledge that this is the battleground of our time and to assess companies' approach to that legislation. As it stands now, in February, the Supreme Court granted a stay of the rule pending the outcome of the case, which is now in the U.S. Court of Appeals. So we're expecting a ruling sometime this summer. Of course, we know that with an 8-member court, that will be complicated. But either way, it's very likely to go back to the Supreme Court with a final opinion sometime in 2017 or 2018. As we assessed this, we found that just 2 companies stand out for their support of the CPP. Those were NextEra Energy and PG&E. We found that Southern has been the most active in opposing the legislation, but several other companies also have been active. Those were AEP, Ameren, DTE, Duke, Entergy, NRG, and PPL. This entire analysis is complicated by the fact that trade groups are also weighing in and are actively participating in the process as well, and these are largely supported by undisclosed corporate contributions, making it challenging to fully attribute where these companies are exerting their influence and where they're not. Finally, we also took a look at the corporate political activity oversight and disclosure at companies using a measurement from the CPA-Zicklin Index of 2015. The Zicklin Center for Corporate Integrity at Baruch College's Zicklin School of Business issues this index each fall, and it assesses the extent to which companies have put in place formal board oversight and disclosure of election spending, including through intermediaries such as trade associations, which are also very active in lobbying. Here we show again the highest and the lowest scoring utilities in our study. Due to space constraints, we left out the middle of the pack. You'll see that the average CPA score for the S&P 500 as a whole was 40, which makes the low scores that we have here stand out as particularly notable. I'll leave it there for now and wait for questions at the end, but in the meantime, I'll turn it over to Heidi to talk more about what we saw this year in our proxy season voting.
All right, thanks very much. This is Heidi, and thanks to Sarah. As you can imagine, it was a fairly challenging task to try to pull together all these different data points, and it took a lot longer than we had expected. So kudos to her for a lot of hard work. I just have a few comments on what is a key barometer of investor opinion, the proxy season, which many folks on the call are pretty familiar with. The proxy season is when companies hold their annual meetings in the United States, usually in the spring, and this presents investors can present shareholder resolutions to companies asking for change. Usually they're about disclosure, and this then allows you to see how investors at large, shareholders in these companies, vote their shares. And so looking just for context at all social and environmental and sustainability-oriented proposals, excluding the corporate governance ones, shows that the total number of resolutions filed has dropped back this year a little bit to about 420, down from an all-time high last year of about 460. The combined number of environmental and sustainability proposals has dropped in sync with this trend. There are 174 this year, down from about 190 in 2014. That drop is largely because the New York City comptroller has focused on proxy access, which I'll talk about a little bit later. The number of social proposals, which includes most prominently corporate political activity, has stayed relatively constant over the last 3 years, although it's dropped a little bit. Next slide. Okay, here you can see what happened on the status of all the proposals. Even though the total number filed has dropped back, the number that's gone to votes has continued to climb each year. It should be about 240 this year. There are question marks on about 40 or 20 of those where some of them still might be withdrawn or omitted from proxy statements. And when we say they're omitted, that means those that were challenged at the SEC under the shareholder proposal rule and left out with the SEC's blessing. But the number in that category is at an all-time low now of just 10%. And in the last 3 years, we've also really seen a drop, as you can see here in the green bar, in the number of proposals withdrawn in general, which I haven't gotten totally to the bottom of. I think this is because proponents may now be asking companies to do more difficult things, or it also could be that the companies left with proposals are just a little bit more recalcitrant. We're not sure right now. Next slide. So on this next slide here, you see that the average support for all proposals is about 21%, which is about twice what it was in maybe 10 years or so ago. It's been going up a lot because mutual funds have started to really pay closer attention to proxy voting, as have a lot of big asset owners. And until this year, environmental proposals tended to earn less support than sustainability and social issues on the blue and the red lines here. But that green line for environmental proposals on average support is now surpassing for this year that of the others. And again, this excludes proxy access and those proposals which relate to the right for shareholders to, large shareholder groups to nominate directors on the company proxy ballot. Those sorts of proposals are actually earning on average majority support, and at this point there's 230 companies that have those rights in place. Next slide. So with that context in mind, we're going to zero in on the proposals just at the companies we examined in this study. And we looked for this slide here, just the resolutions about the environment and political activity. These types of proposals at these companies are getting a lot more support than proposals on these issues do in general. You'll see that 20 proposals went to vote at these companies in each of the last 2 years, which is an increase from previous levels. But the most dramatic change since 2010 has been the increase in the average support, which was nearly 30% this year. This is a big deal since companies generally take some kind of action in response to shareholder resolutions, starting at about 20% support, but it's really hard to ignore votes around 30%, and that's just the average. If you look at the next slide, you can see that there were quite a few proposals this year where they got a fair amount of support. This shows in orange the political activity proposals got the highest votes, right there up at the top, including a majority one on political spending at NiSource. But the environmental resolutions in green on the table here made up the largest volume or number of the high-scoring proposals. NextEra Energy stands out here. It had 2 high-scoring ones, one on the majority one on political spending, but then there was also another one, rather it wasn't a majority one, but it was a high vote. There was another one also asking for information on how it plans to cope with rising sea levels, and that's particularly relevant to that company since its operations are in Florida, which are particularly at risk with rising sea levels. So I think wrapping up on this discussion, the results really show that companies will need to provide more disclosure on their climate risks, climate change strategies, and political involvement if they want to satisfy the key investor constituencies that have supported these resolutions. So looking for the outlook for 2017, we have a few things that can happen that I expect to see going forward. We can see more activity on proxy access. Now that 230 companies have approved this right for investors, we may see some dissident candidates nominated by big investors. Even if they don't run candidates, there's likely to be more focus on board members' environmental and specifically climate risk qualifications. There's another thing to note. There's a group called the 50/50 Climate Project. It's a new effort that seeks to get the 50 biggest institutional investors to push for change at the 50 largest energy companies, including utilities. And it's now working to build a bench of directors who have more climate risk expertise so that there can be folks that can be nominated. And people want to note that this month, CalSTRS announced that's the California State Teachers Retirement System, announced it's changed its guidelines to emphasize that this type of expertise in board nominees is important. But a related question is whether companies will start to highlight the expertise their members already may have. As Sarah talked about, we didn't find much evidence about this. That doesn't mean it's not there, but companies are not talking about it. So the third thing I'd like to mention is that we are likely to see more focus on climate-related executive compensation incentives. Outstanding questions there are, what are the appropriate metrics? For utilities, this might include something tied to coal, as well as rewards for more renewables deployment, energy conservation, and efficiency. On the political front, obviously it's a political season, and the fate of the Clean Power Plan really depends on who the next Supreme Court nominee is to a large extent, so the stakes there are pretty high. And the federal sort of regulatory environment is important, but for utilities, a lot happens at the state level. We'll see more there, and companies spend a lot at the state level, and they got a lot bigger bang for their buck when they spend there. So we'll see more focus on that. And then finally, next year's slate of shareholder resolutions is likely to continue to press for utility business model change, again focusing on these three key components: emissions reductions goals, energy efficiency, and deployment of renewables. This year we saw a focus on utility customers, some of which are seeking and winning more renewable generation provision from their electricity providers, and I think we'll see more of that. And that pretty much wraps it up for me, and we'd be happy to hear any questions or comments that you all might like to have.
Thanks, Heidi. I'd really like to thank Sarah and Heidi. As you've all heard, this was a very in-depth report with numerous metrics, and many of which are technical. And I encourage you all to just download a free copy of the report from irrcinstitute.org and make up your own mind. The reason that we think this is important is both for the content of the report and for looking at it as a potential template for investors to do sectoral analyses of companies and how they are reacting to various challenges, whether climate change or otherwise. In this case, it seemed to lend itself to this sort of analysis because utilities are, while there are clearly state differences and population differences, they are highly regulated. They're obviously in the same sector. They obviously have the same goals, but they face the same relatively homogeneous set of risks and opportunities. And they have, as we saw, very heterogeneous reactions and business strategies. And the one quibble I will have is at various points we use the phrases top and bottom, and I don't know that I would put it that way. I would put it the way that that first slide said, which is there are business plans that seem to cling to the status quo, and there are business plans that seem to embrace a future in which they contemplate what the challenge of climate change will be. Investors can make up their own mind as to which of those business plans they think more aligns with their vision of appropriate payment for risks undertaken or risks mitigated. And I think that this sort of analysis, where you look at a myriad of governance hot buttons, from capital efficiency to what board competency is to political spending, enables you to, how you said, connect the dots. I would perhaps say, look at various data points that combine, almost like a French pointillist painting, gives you a overall picture that is much more coherent than you would think those dots could possibly create. And it does suggest a way to understand what utilities are actually doing when faced with these climate risk challenges, as opposed to just what they say they are doing. If you say one thing but fight lawsuits in a different way, or if you are exposed to coal risk, and coal has clearly re-rated in the marketplace, if you deal with your demand side through advanced metering infrastructure, those are all data points that can be connected. And so this is, we think, very valuable for investors who are utility investors to look at the strategies and business plans that utilities are undertaking as they move into the future. But it also may provide a template of, there'll be different indicators, but the same sort of analysis can be used sectorally to look at other companies as they are contemplating the challenges that they face, whether that is cybersecurity and finance, or internet shopping on retailers. Whatever the issue may be, you can come up with a series of seemingly unrelated data points, put them together, and try to understand a business strategy. Again, I encourage you all to download the report. It is in-depth, it is technical, we understand that. We try to make it as simple as possible without making it simplistic for this webinar, and I am sure there are lots of questions because of that. So I will stop talking and save all the time for questions. Kelly, it's up to you.
Thanks, everyone. So now we're moving on to the Q&A portion of the webinar. And as a reminder, if you have questions, you can go to your control panel. There's a question box. Just type in your question there. We'll read it aloud, and John, Heidi, or Sarah will take a stab at answering your question. So it looks like we have several in the queue. So the first one is, let me scroll through here. Please provide more background on the water stress measurement used in slide 13. How was this measured? Can you take me through the level of risk an investor should be concerned about with an example? With an example, First Energy on how to read the chart. Or is the chart suggesting that the water stress aspect of the screen is the least weighted in generating the final cumulative risk ranking? How does this model work? Thank you. So why don't I scroll to that slide? That might be a little bit helpful. Do you need me to reread that question, Heidi or Sarah?
No, I think I've got it. I think I understand the person's question. It ends up that in the overall ranking of the companies in our study in particular, that was an aspect that was found to be less significant to these particular players than some of the other aspects. So Oxford was looking at power stations located in areas with higher physical baseline water stress, or in areas that are characterized by water conflict or regulatory uncertainty, and are at higher risk of forced operational reduction or cessation, or of profit impairment by water pricing. That's the way they've determined that area of analysis. And if that's something that you want to follow through more specifically for each company, we've actually provided a citation and a link directly to the report, which itself is extensive and really quite long and goes into the issue of water stress as they analyzed it at Oxford in significant detail. It's really quite fascinating.
Thank you. Our next question, what needs to change with investors and boards at utilities to better align cleaner energy business models, cleaner energy innovation with metrics/incentives? What are seen as the key barriers to change?
This is Sarah. Maybe I probably am not the only one who will have an answer to this. One of the things that sort of stood out for me that I think it's important to remember about this, especially for people who are sort of advocating or activists for stronger climate change protections in the case of companies and on corporate boards, is that for all the push that there is from sustainable investors, from civil society, what have you, seeking strengthening of their approaches around climate change, there is, I think, not even equal and opposite pressure from the other side, but in fact much, maybe even stronger opposition to corporate boards focusing on anything other than the bottom line. And you'll see in our report we looked at a couple specific examples of board members who actually were punished by the market in general for having attempted to move things along more quickly in climate change mitigation and adaptation. So one thing I would say is that people who wish to see that agenda change a little bit need to understand that companies, even that where there are a lot of people in the company on the board who would like to do things differently, find a lot of pressure in the reverse, and to take that into account as you try to work with them.
Yeah, this is Heidi. I mean, this is really a crux of the question. You know, does this, how much do people protect the status quo, and how much do they try to change, and how difficult is change? Change is hard, and I think within the sustainable investment community, there's certainly, and in many among investors at large, there's a real sense of peril from climate change, but you know, utilities are also facing really difficult questions on how they actually change millions and millions of dollars of investment, and change is scary, and it's hard, and it's not certain. How you respond to that is difficult. We've tried to sort of lay out some of the ways you can assess the risks and see who's really on the sharpest point here. We're not really in the business of saying who's bad and who's good, but we're trying to frame this in terms of, you know, change-oriented, greatest risk, least risk, to use sort of investment terms. But I don't think you can underestimate the power of the status quo and stasis. It's hard to change and hard to start moving.
Thank you. Our next question, what are your overarching conclusions from this comprehensive review and analysis?
This is Sarah. Again, I'm probably not the only one here. In addition to the point I just made about the countervailing pressure from the marketplace, I would just say that there is a lot of money flying around that has to do with climate change and the way that our regulatory and legislative framework is being structured. And if I came away with anything, it was how little we actually understand about it and how difficult it is to get at that information. Heidi will probably have something to say about this, but to the extent that there's disclosure on this stuff at all, it is entirely inconsistent from state to state, making the data really, really difficult to analyze in any sort of cohesive and comprehensive fashion. And I think just as a sort of citizen and taxpayer, I wish we knew more about it, and I think that is hopefully the area of much greater endeavor in the future.
Well, on the issue of sort of political involvement, I think you would expect that a highly regulated sector, any highly regulated sector, is going to push for regulations that help them. I think the question with so that's not necessarily unusual with respect to utilities, but as Sari said, there's just a lot that we don't know. Regarding lobbying at the state level, where many things are decided for utilities and will be decided in terms of implementation of Clean Power Plan regulations, if that does go through. And aside from the CPP continuing regulatory changes for other reasons and the move away from coal, because gas is more is cheaper and cleaner by many respects. Many decisions are made, and we just don't know. That the disclosure about state level lobbying is not good. It's there in about half the states. It's not there in the other states. And then in the states, even where there is disclosure, so you can get a glimpse of what companies are spending to influence state regulators and legislators, it's very hard and very challenging to track down exactly how money is spent. So there's a lot of interest by investors on this subject. A lot of the focus has been on election spending, but there's much more money in the lobbying space. I don't see that much appetite for lobbying disclosure reform, but that's where a lot of things are happening.
And I think those are great answers from a civil society point of view. I would add from an investor point of view, we often talk about the utility sector, and we just passed a half year, and there have been a lot of half-year reviews that say how sleepy little utilities are a top performer in the U.S. equity markets this year, for various reasons having to do with yield and where interest rates are. What I took away from this is just how much dispersion there is in business plans. Some utilities support CPP, some are suing against it. Some have lots of coal exposure, some have none. Some have a view of how much disclosure and, by inference, how important facing climate change risk is, and others seem to think it's not important at all, at least judging by the level of disclosure. And the old truism that in the short term the market is a voting machine, in the long term the market is a discounting machine, it is, one would hope, is true, and that over time investors should see different return patterns and volatility patterns in utilities with different business plans, and that therefore my takeaway would be that there is much more dispersion in business plans and potentially in future return patterns than is currently thought about in the utility sector.
Thank you. Our next question, will there be a replay available of this webinar? I can take that. Yes, there will be a replay available. It will be posted by tomorrow on the IRRC website. Also, we'll have these slides available and posted on the IRRC Institute website as well. The next question, given the SEC concept release on disclosure, do you have thoughts about better disclosure metrics on board skills and competency?
Let me just, I'm sure we all have individual suggestions. There have been a series of filings recently. I saw that US CIF has put in their response letter. SASB has put in their response letters. Those response letters run tens of pages and are very detailed. So I hate to duck the question, but they're easily available on the web, and I think they would not only include anything we would say, but go far beyond it, and to give any sort of comprehensive answer to that question would probably take a couple of hours. So I would encourage you to go online and look at those. The one thing I would say to the investors and others on the call is regulation works best when all sides are heard from. So if you on the call have not yet put in comment letters, please consider doing so. But there's a lot of information out there, and just in the last week, SASB and SIF have put in their responses, and they really are very extensive. You can agree with them or disagree with them, but they will definitely touch many of the bases that you would have liked us to talk about.
Thank you. Our next question, does Oxford perform a water stress rank for a universe of companies that is available to the public? Russell 3000 perhaps? Is Oxford available for a follow-up on their water stress methodology and research?
I really can't speak to the fullness of their research coverage. The study that I'm referring to was not as extensive as something like the Russell 3000, and of course I can't speak to their availability for follow-up. But all of the references to the study and to the research center in general are provided in the report, and I would certainly encourage you to reach out to them directly for that.
Thank you. Our next question regarding CCS. You said if that technology should ever become viable. We've been hearing about this technology for years. What are its prospects today? When might it become viable?
Oh boy, that's one that
anybody's guess.
That's one that we could spend a long time on. I will, because of the time, be brief, but there's certainly more information out there about it. Look, this has been, according to the companies involved, this has been on the just on the crux of viability for years now. I've been looking at the topic for quite some time. I personally, and again, I'm fairly impartial on the point. I would love for it to be viable. That would be wonderful. But it does not appear that much progress has been made in the last 5 to 10 years in getting it any closer to something that can be deployed on a wide enough scale to make any particular difference. And the recent lawsuit filed against Southern seems, if anything, to set things even further back. I'll add one more tantalizing point to the conversation, which is that some studies emerged this year that suggest that the underground injection of carbon dioxide, along with some of the other things we inject underground, may be responsible for an increase in seismicity in different parts of the country. And if that research holds up and is strengthened by further inquiries, that too could set CCS back even further. So personally, I don't see much reason for optimism that it's going to be something that's viable in the near future.
And Sarah, just because my lawyers will insist on my saying this, I would just remind everyone that the allegations against Southern are allegations. Just because we're small, impoverished, not-for-profit, I'd like not to be sued.
Agreed. Allegations.
Thank you. Our next question, if climate change is seen as a material risk for utility investors, then why are most investors supporting metrics, incentives, and say-on-pay approval that mostly support the status quo for existing high-carbon utility businesses?
Well, those are questions that anyone who is a member of the investing public and members of investment committees from large institutional investors should ask themselves. I think things are changing. I think that the say-on-pay votes, rather not the say-on-pay votes, the proxy access votes are an interesting metric. They question the direction and the sort of nomination process and the sort of high top leadership of companies in many respects, and were being proposed with direct links to companies with high carbon risk, and as well as some other issues with respect to say-on-pay. So I think things are actually changing. They may be not changing very quickly, but any kind of challenge to corporate management gets a heck of a lot more traction now than it did in the past, and I think that climate change makes that makes those challenges even more piquant.
I would also just add that we tend to talk about investors as if they're monolithic. Clearly, the investment community is very heterogeneous. Sarah talked about pushback against board members and managements which had invested in more change-oriented business plans. That costs money in the short term. If you are looking at quarterly relative returns, you may not want to do that. So part of it depends on the time frame of the investors. Heidi's charts on vote totals, where they're now starting to average about 30%, suggests that there are 70% that don't vote that way on average. So I think what we're pointing out here is that there is dispersion among utilities. There's also dispersion among investors. There seems to be a trend line, but that is far from saying that there's unanimity.
Thank you. Our next question, have you received any feedback from the utility industry or companies regarding the report?
Well, I'll just take that. We have not received a lot of feedback thus far, but I was at a conference not very long ago and pointed out to one of the companies who shall remain unnamed that had a very high carbon risk and didn't look so great or looked very status quo oriented, shall we say. And this person said, look, this sort of report is very helpful because it helps me make the case for action on climate risk mitigation, on more disclosure. This person was in the sustainability office of the company. So I think, to John's point, not only are investors not monolithic, companies are not monolithic. There are different sort of strands of pressure within companies. Our whole reason for being at SI2 is to provide a really robust, good, common, agreed body of knowledge to have really good decision making. This will help companies to compare themselves to each other and decide if they want to change or not.
The one comment that I'll share that I got from senior management of a utility that would have been in the mid to status quo, not all the way to left-hand extreme, but not on the right-hand side either, was fair report. That was it. It was a very restrained comment, but to me that's high praise because, again, IRC Institute is non-advocacy, and what we want to do is put out there this sort of factual reporting and analysis that will enable people to have the discussion at a higher fact plane. You can argue that the Clean Power Plan is an overreach. You could argue that it doesn't go far enough, but at least let's all argue from the same factual basis, and that's what this report does.
Thank you. That concludes our questions. We thank everyone for those really insightful questions. Just to conclude, here's a slide here with the contacts for Sarah, Heidi, and John. If you have any follow-up questions, they're delighted to respond to those. We thank all of you for your time this afternoon, and encourage you again to download the report. A replay will be posted by tomorrow, as will be these PowerPoint slides. So again, thank you so much for your attention, and we hope that you have a nice afternoon. Thank you.